boiled for about that long.
Yeah.
Hello, how are you? Did you start a new job?
10 minutes.
Yeah.
That's all he was like.
Where
And
is
but
it?
then that too. No.
Okay.
I'm still working for the high school.
Okay. Neat. In the library?
Me and Andrew's gonna be going out of town tomorrow.
Where y'all going? Back to Kentucky?
Yeah. I go up there once a month, see my grandkids.
Yeah. Who's driving?
He, just me and Andrew. Andrew won't drive.
You could drive up there, couldn't you, Andrew?
Andrew, what?
You could drive, couldn't you?
I drive body one, not car.
Okay. I drive, I live there, not car.
He says he drives a rod around more, not a car.
Right.
And my brother, my mom. Check for, his house.
Okay.
It's just conversion. He said I can't, they're fucking me too much.
Hey, he got a new statue for you, big 12-foot scarecrow. It's voice activated, or get closer to the activation.
Yeah.
That's hollering at you.
Hey, Wayne.
Hey, sir.
How you doing?
Good, how are you, sir?
Pretty good.
Now, you notice I'm setting up here, if anything starts, it'll be Mark starting.
Okay. Mark will be the one that starts. Okay. I'll keep that in mind. I got my eye on both of them. I'm
2 weeks, we'll
Begging.
talk to him and then set it up for Thursday
Oh,
afternoon.
yeah. That's okay.
I was Kathy.
You teaching this all the way through, or somebody? You teaching this all the way through, somebody?
Well, we're gonna be swapping back and forth. Dan. I've got this week, and next week, Dan.
I'll see all that. I'm gonna get this stuff wrong.
You wanna get the first chapter? You already got the first
Yeah, we did that Sunday.
That was just I have plenty. We're gonna go downstairs. I'm gonna be out there. A load of two guys that are in the house, on 3 sections, 3 feet, all connected together, it's like a centipede.
Yeah, that's kind of tough.
Yeah. Made my room and all.
Good.
Hurricane.
I went from 0 to 10. If I'm gonna go, I go hard.
All right, well, it's about time for us to get started. We're gonna be on lesson 2 tonight. I'm about the prophet Obadiah. Obadiah. Before we get started in class, Brent, if you would, to lead us in a word of prayer.
Father, we come to you this evening, and we are grateful that we have an opportunity to come and study a portion of your word, to come together to help edify one another, and to speak about the things that are in your word, to learn from one another, and to help each other to grow closer and also closer to you. Father, we ask that you would look at each and every one of our individual lives, that you may help us understand the areas that we need to improve in, that you would want us to become closer to you in, that we would be able to recognize what we have deficiencies, and that we would have a heart that's willing to make the appropriate changes where needed, and have the right attitudes in doing so. Father, we ask that you would be with all those in this congregation who are sick, fighting different ailments and illnesses, we ask that you would heal them, that you would restore their health, Heavenly Father, so that they can be able to function in a manner to where they can be able to come back and attend with us and work with us. So, Father, even more so, we ask that you would be with those who are spiritually sick, those who are struggling spiritually, those who are not living the way that they should be, those who are walking in sin and that we may not know or have any idea. Father, help us be able to check on them, to encourage them, to help them, and to do our part, to do our best to help restore them back into the right relationship with you, Heavenly Father, that we know is ultimately their decision as you are sitting there with open arms. We ask that you would put something on their heart and in their way that causes them to recognize that at the end of this life, there's nothing that matters but being in heaven with you. And Father, help us all to have that mindset. Ask that you be with Lee this evening as he breaks on us those things that he's prepared. Help us have the right hearts and attitudes as we glean learnings from your word. We say and pray. Amen.
All right. We're going to start in the book of Obadiah. It is the shortest book in the Old Testament. So what we're going to do is we'll actually read through quite a bit of this. It is so short. We're going to get a little bit of background on Obadiah before we get started here. And the name Obadiah just means servant of the Lord. A lot of those Old Testament names that we read, there was a purpose, there was a meaning behind them. And Obadiah's name here is certainly indicative of what type of person he was. He was a prophet of God, and that would have made him a servant of the Lord. Now, we see that there are about 13 men, according to Brother Harkrider, in the Old Testament that are named Obadiah. It's a very common name that we see in the Old Testament, and we simply don't know which one this was. Okay, we just don't have any idea which Obadiah is the one who wrote this very short book that we're studying tonight. Now, probably the most well-known of that bunch would have been King Ahab's servant. King Ahab's servant was named Obadiah. And he was a good man. You think with Ahab, he probably didn't have very many good men working for him. But Obadiah worked very closely with him, evidently. But he was the servant that went out to look for water along with Ahab. And while they're out looking for water, Obadiah runs into Elijah here at near the end of that drought, that 3.5-year drought. And we find out in that story that Obadiah was one of the men who had taken and hid some of the prophets of God. He had hidden 100 prophets of God in a cave, 50 in one cave and 50 in the other, and this is while Jezebel was trying to kill them. That story is over in 1 Kings chapter 18. There's no hard evidence in this book that helps us date it. Okay? We see that the name Obadiah, that's all we're given. We don't know, it doesn't say that this was Obadiah, the son of somebody like it does with many of the other prophets. It doesn't say Obadiah, the son of, who prophesied during the days of. A lot of these prophets would get a lot of information on them, but we really don't get any information. We don't get any hard information as to the time which Obadiah prophesied. There is some information, I think, that we can draw from it. I think we can see that Obadiah, probably without a doubt, would have been written after the kingdom divided, because it does reference Judah, and it seems to reference Judah as a nation there in verse 12. And it would have been written after a time when Judah and Jerusalem had been attacked and plundered by its enemies. Now, when you read something like that, you hear something like that, at least with me, my first impression would have been the Babylonian captivity, when Nebuchadnezzar came in and took the city. But if you think back, and you look back through the Old Testament, there were several times that happened. There were several times that Jerusalem was actually plundered by her enemies. Before we move on and look at just a few of those, or any comments or questions?
Yeah. Is this the same Obadiah that was mentioned in Revelation 11:15?
We don't know.
Because it doesn't say any time.
Yeah.
It doesn't say his name.
Yeah, we don't know which one it was.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so we see here that Judah and Jerusalem, which this is why it makes it so difficult to give a time frame of when this happened, but they were attacked and plundered a lot of times. This started early on in the 5th year of Rehoboam. Now, he was the first king over Judah after the kingdom split. But in his 5th year, Shishak, the king of Egypt, came up. In 2 Chronicles chapter 12 and verse 9, it says, "So Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem and took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took everything. He also carried away the gold shields which Solomon had made." So we see one time there that they were attacked and plundered. Again, with the Philistines and the Arabs during the reign of Jehoram, which is just a few years after the first time, there in 2 Chronicles 21, verses 16 and 17, it says, "Moreover, the Lord stirred up against Jehoram the spirit of the Philistines and the Arabians who were near the Ethiopians. And they came up into Judah and invaded it and carried away all the possessions that were found in the king's house, and also his sons and his wives, so that there was not a son left to him except Jehoahaz, the youngest of his sons." So we see them being plundered here. We also see captives being taken away here. So when we start seeing things like this, this is what's described in Obadiah, but we just don't know which time that it took place. Again, Hazael, king of Syria, came up during the reign of Joash. It says when he came up that he destroyed in, I said Syria, and my computer thought I said Syria. So it says in 2 Chronicles chapter 22, verses 23 and verse 24. "So it happened in the spring of the year that the army of Syria came up against him, and they came to Judah and Jerusalem, and destroyed all the leaders of the people from among them, and sent all their spoil to the king of Damascus, for the army of the Syrians came with a small company of men. But the Lord delivered a very great army into their hand, because they had forsaken the Lord God of their fathers. So they executed judgment against Joash." Another time that we see Jerusalem being attacked was Jehoash, king of Israel. He came in during the reign of Amaziah. In 2 Kings chapter 14, 2 Kings chapter 14 and verse 34, verses 13 and 14, it says, "Then Jehoash, king of Israel, captured Amaziah, king of Judah, the son of Jehoash," there we have captives, "the son of Ahaziah at Bethshemesh, and he went to Jerusalem and broke down the wall of Jerusalem, from the gate of Ephraim to the corner gate 400 cubits. And he took all the gold and silver, all the articles that were found in the house of the Lord and in the treasures of the king's house and hostages, and returned to Samaria." Time and time again, this is going on because the people of Judah were not following God. God would send somebody in, and many times, more times than even I would have thought about, Jerusalem was taken. The foreign armies were inside the walls of Jerusalem, breaking down walls, taking things out of the house of God, taking things out of the king's house, and continuing to take captives. We see this a couple more times with Sennacherib. Remember, Sennacherib came into Judah. He did not take Jerusalem, but he did take all the other fortified cities, of Judah at that time, in 2 Kings 18 and verse 13. But it wasn't too long after that the Assyrians returned during the reign of Manasseh. Now, Manasseh was Hezekiah's son, probably the most wicked king that Judah had. It was because of his sins that they went into Babylonian captivity. But they came in and even took Manasseh himself away as a prisoner. And also, of course, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, when he comes into Jerusalem, he lays siege to the city. He takes captives away from there on at least 3 major waves of captives he takes away to Babylonian captivity. Around 605, I think what was the next time, about 597, then around 586, 587 BC is when he comes back, breaks down the walls, destroys the temple, it pretty much destroys all of Jerusalem. So because there were so many times that this happened, it's very difficult for us to get a date on Obadiah.
I got the CD of Daniel. I got it. So if anybody here wants it's good CD.
Pretty much stays with the story, huh?
It stays with the story.
Good. Good. Any comments or questions over any of this before we move on? Okay. All right, who did Obadiah prophesy against? Edom. He prophesied against Edom, didn't he? There in Obadiah, verse 1, we find out who he is going to prophesy against. The vision of Obadiah, thus says the Lord God concerning Edom. So he's going to be prophesying against Edom. He goes on and says, we've heard a report from the Lord, and a messenger has been sent among the nations, saying, arise and let us go up against her for battle. So God has sent out messengers, and he's going to bring the nations against Edom. He's going to bring judgment on Edom. So who was Edom?
Esau.
Descendants of Esau. Yeah, exactly. They were the descendants of Esau, who was the twin brother of Jacob. Okay. What was Jacob's other name? What was Edom, or what was Esau's other name? Edom. He was also called Edom. So we have both those names being used as the nations that descended from them. Both of them were the sons of Isaac and Rebekah there in Genesis chapter 25. What we remember most about Esau is what? He sold his birthright. Yeah. He sold his birthright there in Genesis 25 and verse 30. It says, and Esau said to Jacob, please feed me with that same red stew, for I am weary. Therefore, his name was called Edom. And Edom means red. So, evidently it had something, this red had something to do with the stew. And the color of the stew is why he was called Edom. He was also red and very hairy when he was born. But this verse ties it to the red stew. All right, there in Genesis 25, verse 3. Any comments over any of that? We're going to go through a little bit more of that as we go along here to kind of get a little background on these two nations. All right, so Esau sold his birthright, which was a double portion of the inheritance. He sold that to Jacob for a bowl of stew, but Jacob got the family blessing by deceit. Okay, the birthright and the blessing were two different things. The birthright was the inheritance; it was a double portion of the inheritance. The blessing was what the leader of the family would bestow upon the child that was going to take over the leadership role of the family. Okay, normally that would have been the firstborn. But it was not always firstborn, and it certainly was not firstborn in this case because of the deceit of Jacob. Remember, as Isaac had gotten old and his eyes were starting to fail, he couldn't see very good, and he was getting close to dying, that Rebekah got Jacob. She dressed him up in Esau's clothes, put some animal skins on his arms. So that give you an idea. Esau must have been real hairy guy, probably hairy like a dog. But, you know, he goes in, and Isaac says, hey, the voice is Jacob's, but you smell like Esau and you feel like Esau. So he went ahead and blessed him and made him the ruler over his brothers. Now that was something that had been prophesied about before they were born. Rebecca was kind of concerned because things just didn't feel right. The two kids were wrestling inside of her. And in Genesis 25 and verse 22, it says, but the children struggled together within her. And she said, if all is well, why am I like this? So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples shall be separated from your body. 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So that's the prophecy that was given by God. Now, if Isaac would have had his way, he would have given that blessing to Esau. But Rebekah got her way and deceived him into giving it to Jacob. In Genesis 27 and verse 29, here is that part of that blessing that he gives to Jacob. Let peoples serve you and nations bow down to you. Be master over your brethren, and let your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be those who bless you. So we see in that family blessing that Isaac bestowed upon Jacob, he made him ruler of the family. Any comments over that?
There's another blessing too. Jacob, Joseph's 2 sons, he blessed the younger one over the older one.
Right.
So Joseph tried to move his hand.
Very similar situation, wasn't it? Yeah, he blessed the younger instead of the older.
You know, you wonder why Isaac would bless the younger rather than the older. And he probably was, he was a man of the dirt, he was a man of the field, he liked to hunt and all that. And I think Isaac probably liked to do some of that, I don't know. But he sure was not going to take his oldest son.
Well, they had favorites, didn't they? Isaac's favorite was Esau, and Rebekah's favorite was Jacob. That's not a good plan as a parent to have favorites. We see problems that have been caused, you know, even to the time of this story. That probably some of it dealt with the jealousy of one child over the other. Any other comments?
Am I confused, or do I remember right that Esau was sort of born first, but his brother grabbed him by the heel and pulled him back in and made?
No, Esau was born, but Jacob had a hold of his heel.
Okay.
So Esau was born first. Jacob was born second. Now, because of what Jacob had done, Esau hated him. Esau absolutely hated him, and Esau wanted to kill him. And his plan was, as soon as Isaac was dead, to kill Jacob. Well, Mama finds out, and Mama says, you got to get out of here. So he takes off, goes back to some of her family, and while he's back with her family, that's when he works for Leah and Rachel and Leah. But I get that right, Rachel.
Worked for Leah.
He worked for Leah. He worked for Leah. He worked for Rachel first, got Leah, then had to work another 7 years after that. Anyway, he spends about 20 years with Laban and his family while he is away from Esau. Any other comments before we move along?
Well, he got to live with her the second term.
While he was working.
While he was working, yeah. Okay. We know that Jacob hated Esau, but they seem to have gotten past that. Okay? They got past that. They finally made up. Jacob comes back after about 20 years, and he's done very well while he was living with Laban. But while he's over there, Esau's done pretty good too. And they come back and they kind of reconcile, but this hatred that they had continued on into their descendants. Okay, their children picked up on this, and this continued on as a separation between the children of of Jacob, or between the children of Esau and the children of Jacob for generations after this. We remember when the Israelites came up out of the land of Egypt. They came up out of the land of Egypt, and they're right here on the border of Edom, and they want to pass through Edom. And boy, they ask very nicely. They ask very nicely if they can go through. Turn over to Numbers chapter 20. Numbers chapter 20, starting in about verse 14. It says, "Now Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom." Okay, these were family. "Thus says your brother Israel, you know all the hardship that has befallen us, how our fathers went down to Egypt, and we dwelt in Egypt a long time, and the Egyptians afflicted us and our fathers. When we cried out to the Lord, he heard our voice and sent the angel and brought us up out of Egypt. Now here we are in Kadesh, a city on the edge of your border. Please let us pass through your country. We will not pass through fields or vineyards, nor will we drink water from wells. We will go along the king's highway. We will not turn to the right hand or to the left until we have passed through your territory." He said, all we want to do is just move through. We just want to pass through. We're not going to take anything. We're not going to be in any trouble. Just let us pass through, brother. And in verse 18, "Then Edom said to him, you shall not pass through my land, lest I come out against you with the sword. So the children of Israel said to him, we will go by the highway, and if I or my livestock drink any of your water, then I will pay for it. Let me only pass through on foot, nothing more. Then he said, you shall not pass through. So Edom came out against them with many men and with a strong hand. Thus Edom refused to give Israel passage through his territory. So Israel turned away from him." Now, folks, this was close to 500 years after the time that Jacob and Esau had their trouble. Here we are almost 500 years later, and Edom is still holding a grudge. And they're not going to let Israel pass through. So we see this animosity between these two, especially on the side of Edom, all through their history. All through the history. Any comments?
Yeah, Lynn, that's a direct reflection of how we can sow discord, right? We can say something and continue to pour into people hatred, or can you believe, or look what they've done, and you never know how people take a thing and run with it. And you see something 500 years later where this discord has been sown, even to the point of, they know this is their brethren, and they're not even going to let them pass through. They say, we'll even pay if we take none. Why? Because y'all are dirty. How do we know? Because your daddy and great-great-great-great-great-granddaddy was dirty. And this is what y'all did to us, right? So how do you reconcile a thing once you start mess, and then you say, hey, wait, I want to pull that back? You can't. So I think this is a great story of sowing and reaping, right? And it's evident of what happens. And I think we should take very wise counsel from the Bible.
Absolutely. Any other comment? Somebody else have something?
I'll just say that when we're having class, people that are streaming at home can't hear the questions. So when we have a question in class, we'll get the teachers to maybe repeat what's said by the person that's answering the question. That'll help them at home.
Okay, we can do that. We'll start repeating the question so folks at home can hear them. If I repeat it wrong, correct me. Any other thoughts? But yeah, this idea of sowing discord, what Brent was talking about, that it started 500 years before, and they just kept on and kept on and kept on until it got to where it was an irreconcilable situation, at least for one side. Now, God had commanded Israel to be good to their brother. He had commanded them to be good to the Edomites, but the Edomites wouldn't let them. Bill?
Have you read or heard that when Jacob wanted to go to Esau's land, and if he had let him go, it was about an 11-day journey, and the other went 40 years, and they went straight. Have you ever heard that?
I've not heard about the time frame, whether it was 11 days through the land and 40 years around it.
Yeah.
Well, we know they spent 40 years in the wilderness. I don't know if that's how long it would have taken them to gotten around it, but it would have been a much more direct path if they could have gone straight through Edom if they would allow them to. Anything else? Cindy?
I just looked back in Genesis and it gives the whole genealogy of Esau and Edom. And the second verse says, and Esau took his wives from the daughter of Canaan. And that could have been a good thing.
Yeah, Esau took his wives from the daughter of Canaan.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
everybody else there. So
Yeah.
that didn't help the fact of messing up the family.
Right. And even his mother said, his wives are grieving me, or something along those lines. Esau's wives were more than Rebecca could take. Okay, let's move on then. If we look at our map, Edom was located on the south of the Dead Sea, right down there at the bottom. I know that's kind of, the writing is pretty small, but where the red circle is, there is Edom. So it's down south of Jerusalem, down south of Judea, or Judah, and they dwelt in the mountain range that was known as Mount Seir. It was known as Mount Seir. According to Brother Hartrider, that was an area about 20 miles wide through this mountain range and about 100 miles long. They had what we might consider, and what they definitely consider, almost a perfect situation, an easily defensible position in those mountains. Always good if you can have the high ground. You take somebody in the plains, if they've got a city out in the plains, they've got to build a wall all the way around it. And they can also be attacked from every side. You take somebody who's got a city in the mountains, usually there's only one or two ways that you can get to it. A lot of times you have natural defenses with sheer cliffs and things of that nature where you don't have to defend every side of the city. Their high position gave them a considerable advantage over any of the attacking armies that might come their way, and that led to an immense amount of arrogance on their part. They became very arrogant, very prideful. They didn't think anybody could touch them there in those mountains. They thought they were pretty much invincible. Any comments? Okay. All right, well, let's get into the text then. God is bringing judgment on Edom. Verses 1 through 9 spells it out without a doubt that God's going to bring judgment on them. There in verse 1, as we read a while ago, he's calling the nations to rise up against Edom. Verse 2, he says, I'm going to make you small among the nations. Behold, I'll make you as small among the nations, you shall be greatly despised. Here is Edom thinking they are big and mighty, and God's going to cut them down to size. God's going to cut them down to size. Everybody else is going to start looking at them as if they are nothing, and they are eventually going to be nothing because of the judgment of God. In verse 3, may be one of the key verses. Maybe the key verse here in Obadiah, when he says, the pride of your heart has deceived you, you who dwell in the clefts of the rock, whose habitation is high, who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? Pride. Their pride in their heart had deceived them. They had begun to believe that they were invincible. They had begun to believe that they were untouchable, that nobody could do them any harm. But God says, I'm going to bring you down. Verse 4. From there I will bring you down. Any comments? Folks, it doesn't matter how powerful a nation is, how well defended a nation is. If God decides he's going to bring them down, they're coming down. And the same thing goes for individuals. Sometimes we have individuals who become very prideful, very arrogant, and they rebel against God. And they don't think, nothing's going to happen to me. God's not going to touch me. Matter of fact, a lot of times they think there is no God. Well, we get to thinking like that. Maybe not in this life, but always in the life to come, God will bring us down. Yeah. He let his wives influence him. Well, he started that mistake by marrying the only thing he did that was wrong, but marrying his former women that he was not supposed to marry. You know, evil companions corrupt good morals, don't they? That's always been the case. Anything else before we move on? Verse 5 and 6, he basically says there's not going to be anything left. He said, if thieves had come to you, if robbers by night, oh, how you will be cut off. Would they not have stolen until they had enough? If grape gatherers had come to you, would they not have left gleanings? Oh, how Esau shall be searched out, how his hidden treasures shall be sought out. He said, if you had a thief break in, he's going to leave something. He's going to take everything. He said, you had grape gatherers come through. They're going to get most of the grapes. There's going to be a little bit left. But he said, that's not going to be the case with Edom. He said, even your hidden treasures are going to be sought out, and those things are going to be taken. You're going to be completely wiped out as a nation, and you're going to be completely wiped out as a people. Even the friends we're going to turn on there in verse 7. All the men in your confederacy shall force you to the border. The men at peace with you shall deceive you and prevail against you. Those who eat your bread shall lay a trap for you, and no one is aware of it. That's another pretty good warning right there. We need to be careful who our friends are. Be careful who your friends are, because Edom's friends turned on them. Verses 8 and 9, we see that all the people are going to be destroyed. And then we see the reason for God's judgment coming in verses 10 through 16. We've already mentioned the pride there in verse 3. But verse 10, because they were guilty of violence against their brother. God cares how we treat other folks. God, without a doubt, cares about how we treat other folks there in Matthew chapter 25. Who were the ones that were rewarded? The ones who gave just a cup of water, right? To some of these little ones, he said, when you did that, you did it to me. Who were the ones that were punished? Or the ones who refused to help others. God cares how we treat other people, without a doubt, especially our brothers and sisters. In verse 11, it says that they had acted just like the rest of Jerusalem's enemies. Their brother had acted just like the rest of their enemies. Verse 12, they gloated, they rejoiced and spoke proudly when Judah was destroyed. They took a lot of joy in their brother being destroyed. Folks, that's something we can't do, especially as Christians. If we see another Christian hurting, we see another Christian in trouble, we see another Christian in sin. We don't need to sit back and say, yeah, I knew that was going to happen to him. Yep. I knew he wasn't any good from the start. And we can't have that type of attitude. We need to be the type of person who's trying to help them. Reach out to them, try to get them back on the right path. That's certainly not what Edom was doing here. They were taking joy in the destruction of Judah and Jerusalem. Any comments down through verse 12? Verse 13, we see that they went in and looted Judah and Jerusalem after the defeat. They captured those. You know, the city's being attacked, and you've got people running off and trying to get away, and they began to capture the fugitives, those who were trying to run, and then turning them back over to their enemies. But verse 15 says the day of the Lord's near. God's day of judgment. When the Bible talks about the day of the Lord, most of the time it is talking about a day of judgment. God's day of judgment for the nations was near. It was coming. And Edom was not going to be able to escape it. Any comments? Let's go ahead and get verses 15 and 16. So what they had done to their brother was going to be done to them. God was going to take what they had done and turn it back on them. They were going to have to suffer the same thing that they had done to others. Any comments down through verse 16 from anybody?
You know, in verse 12, I'm backing up a little bit.
That's okay.
I was looking at this guy really dislikes his brother. You should not gaze, nor you should have rejoiced, nor you have spoken, that you have spoken proudly. And one word, simple phrase, you know.
He didn't like him at all. He hated him, actually. And what a shame that is. You would think that relationship should have been closer, but it was not.
He didn't like him, he hated him, and he failed to see that it was his own fault.
Yeah.
And we see that a lot, like, we see the perspective that we wanna see. I can't believe he did this to me, I can't believe this, you did it. Like, it was your decision that led to that, you know.
Right. But a lot of times we bring it on ourselves, don't we? Okay, let's move on then.
We're thinking about Matthew chapter 7, verse 1, judge not that you be not judged. That verse falls right in line with that, Matthew chapter 7.
Yeah, what he's talking about there in Matthew chapter 7 is this hypocritical judgment, isn't it? You know, you're gonna condemn others for something that you've done yourself. All right. Then in verses 17 through 21, we see God giving a glimmer of hope, not to Edom, because Edom's going to be wiped out. He's told him, you're not going to be any more. And ultimately, I think that is pretty much completed by the time about AD 70. You don't hear anything else about the Edomites after Jerusalem is destroyed in the temple in AD 70. They're gone. But we see that we have a reference here to Israel's final triumph. Now, when we start looking at some of these things, it gives Israelites hope. Remember, some of them had been taken captive. Were they in Babylonian captivity? I don't know, but they were captive somewhere. Probably, in my opinion, in Babylonian captivity, but it's hard to pinpoint that. But they had hope. He was giving them hope. And as we look at these prophecies, we want to look at it from the standpoint of what it was offering them, and also look at it from the standpoint of what is it talking about for us. Because a lot of them have a dual fulfillment. So when we get into verse 17, we see that deliverance and holiness is going to be found on Mount Zion. As we go through this particular prophecy, I think probably 90% of it is talking about the coming of the Messiah and the kingdom. Coming of Jesus and the establishment of his kingdom, or the church. So we know that deliverance and holiness, that came through Jesus, didn't it? We don't really see, we see some of the Israelites returning from captivity, but we never really see that Israel restored, physical Israel restored to the point that it was at some times in its history, especially like it was in the days of David. But we talk about deliverance and holiness, that's going to be in Mount Zion. This was giving them something to look forward to. But this deliverance, according to Romans 11, verses 23 through 27, started something there that we'll just move on. Romans 11, verses 23 through 27, it says, and they also, talking about physical Israel, if they do not continue in unbelief, will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. He's talking to the Gentiles here, these Gentile Christians. He said, don't boast against them now. Hey, if they want to turn around and not remain in unbelief, that we'll graft them back in to the people of God. He says, for if you were cut out of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these who are natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? Skipping on down to verse 26, he said, so all Israel will be saved. Now, a lot of people read that and they say, well, see, all Israel is going to be saved. But what he has just said is, if they don't remain in unbelief. So that's the way it's going to happen. If they don't remain in unbelief, then they'll be saved. But those that do remain in unbelief are going to be lost, just like anybody. But he goes on in verse 26, and so all Israel will be saved, as it is written, the deliverer will come out of Zion, and he will turn away ungodliness from Jacob. For this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. So we see the deliverer coming out of Zion. It's talking about Jesus, and deliverance is found only through Christ and only in his kingdom. We notice there in verse 18 that God's enemies will be destroyed. Okay? We see a physical destroying of Edom. ultimately, all of God's enemies will be destroyed, on that day of judgment. Verses 19 and verse 20, it says those who were captive will possess the promised land, basically is what he's saying there. He lists off a lot of different areas that were going to be possessed by what sounds like a lot of different people, but the ones that's going to be possessed by are the Jews. He's talking about Israel is going to possess all these different areas. Now, if you look back in history, did that happen physically? It did not. It did not. So it's a spiritual application that's being made here. He's talking about spiritual Israel is going to possess their promised land. When he talks about the mountains of Esau, they're going to possess. Philistia was going to be possessed. The fields of Ephraim and Samaria and Gilead, the land of the Canaanites, the cities of the south, all of these were going to be possessed by Israel. Well, what were all of these cities? What was all this area? That was their physical promised land. But he's making a spiritual application to it. He's saying that spiritual Israel is going to possess their promised land, which is what? Heaven. Yeah, heaven.
You know, there's a certain amount of this still going on over there.
Oh, yeah. So I think we can kind of sum up this last part here, these last few verses, that all of God's enemies are going to be destroyed. So we don't want to be an enemy of God. That's not a side we want to be on, because all of his enemies are going to be destroyed, and the spiritual Israel is going to possess its promised land. It's going to possess all. Any comments or questions? I had to run through that last part pretty quick. All right. Well, if y'all promise to be good, I'll let you out early.
Lee, one thing since you're through, I didn't want to interrupt the train of thought, but it's interesting, we think, we don't realize what we do follows us all the time. But it's always, you know, when we have children, we always say the first one name first. Why do we say Jacob and Esau, Rachel and Leah? Because of what we just studied. How many years has it been? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So after all this time, we still say Jacob and Esau rather than Esau and Jacob. It doesn't sound like it's easy.
Yeah, I understand. That's why I was always saying to listen. All right. Well, we will start with the book of Joel on Sunday morning. And we'll do that Sunday and next Wednesday.
You could be here next Sunday.
You're not gonna be here?
Nope. I can't go back.
Dr. Pay. Going back to Kentucky. We should be careful. You keep steady in line.
Goes there Friday. Not sure get us a favor.
Got too late to burn it out. Like that on Saturday.
You got that fire? Okay.